All right, good morning, guys. Today is Wednesday. We're in our final week of learning and our last couple of days of Fahrenheit 451 before we wrap this book up as well. Last week, where we left off, Montag was on the run and had no other place to go other than Faber's house. So he went to Faber's house, was hanging out there for a little bit when he realized that, he didn't want to draw any attention to Faber. Like, he didn't want to get him caught up in this, so he was going to take off. And Faber decided to flip on his TV. He had this little handheld TV. He mentions how he never wanted anything that would be too distracting, like a parlor wall. Just a little handheld TV that won't be too distracting. And we can tell in our society that isn't necessarily the case, but they are very much handheld TVs. And he turns on the TV and sees a full-on manhunt for Montag. So it's like reality television. It's like a mix between cops or some of these other reality TV shows where they show kind of a day in the life of a police force, as well as like some of these like high-speed chases type of things. And they're saying his name on TV. It's being broadcast. It's early in the morning. It's like 3 a.m. But you get the idea. Like, there's a full-on news bulletin going on here. They've released another hound at the house. And so it's going to be a chase. And Montag is basically like going to have to run for his life. He gets an old suitcase from Faber full of his clothes, a bottle of whiskey, and he's like, peace, I gotta go. And so they don't know if they're going to see each other again. But on page 130, that's where we left off, as Montag was running out of his house, making his way down toward the river. So let's pick up with that, shall we? Montag ran. He could feel the hound, like autumn, come cold and dry and swift, like a wind that didn't stir grass, that didn't jar windows or disturb leaf shadows on the white sidewalks as it passed. The hound did not touch the world. It carried its silence with it, so you could feel the silence building up a pressure behind you all across town. Montag felt the pressure rising and ran. He stopped for breath on his way to the river, to peer through dimly lit windows of wakened houses, and saw the silhouettes of people inside watching their parlor walls. And on their walls, was the mechanical hound, a breath of neon vapor, spidered along, here and gone, now at Elm Terrace, Lincoln, Oak Park, and up the alley toward Faber's house. Oh, go past, thought Montag. Don't stop, go on, don't turn in. On the parlor wall, Faber's house, with its sprinkler system pulsing in the night air. The hound paused, quivering. No, Montag held to the windowsill. This way, here. The croquet needle flicked out and in, out and in. A single clear drop of the stuff of dreams fell from the needle as it vanished in the hound's muzzle. Montag held his breath, like a doubled fist in his chest. The mechanical hound turned and plunged away from Faber's house down the alley again. Montag snapped his gaze to the sky. The helicopters were closer, a great blowing of insects to a single light source. With an effort, Montag reminded himself again that this was no fictional episode to be watched on his run to the river. It was, in actuality, his own chess game he was witnessing, move by move. He shouted to give himself the necessary push away from the last house window and the fascinating seance going on in there. Hell! And he was away and gone. The alley, a street, the smell of the river. Leg out, leg down, leg out, leg down. 20 million Montags running soon if the cameras caught him. 20 million Montags running like an ancient flickery Keystone comedy. Cops, robbers, chasers, and the chased. Hunters and the hunted. He had seen it 1,000 times. Behind him now, 20 million silently baying hounds ricocheted across parlors. 3 cushion shooting from right wall to center to left, gone. Right, center, left wall, gone. Montag jammed his seashell to his ear. Police suggest entire population in the Elm Terrace area do as follows. Everyone in every house and every street open a front or rear door or look from the windows. Fugitive cannot escape if everyone in the next minute looks from his house. Ready! Of course. Why hadn't they done it before? Why in all the years had this game been tried? Everyone up, everyone out. He couldn't be missed. The only man running alone in the night city. The only man proving his legs. At the count of 10 now. 1, 2. He felt the city rise. 3. He felt the city turn to its thousands of doors. Faster, leg up, leg down. 4. The people sleepwalking in their hallways. 5. He felt their hands on the doorknobs. The smell of the river was cool, and like a solid rain, his throat was burnt rust, and his eyes were wept dry with running. He yelled as if this yell would jet him on, fling him the last 100 yards. 6, 7, 8. The doorknobs turned on 5,000 doors. 9. He ran out away from the last row of houses on a slope leading down to a solid moving blackness. 10. The doors opened. He imagined thousands on thousands of faces peering into yards, into alleys, and into the sky. Faces hid by curtains, pale and night-frightened faces, like gray animals peering from electric caves. Faces with gray, colorless eyes, gray tongues, and gray thoughts looking out through the numb flesh of the face. But he was at the river. He touched it, just to be sure it was real. He waded in and stripped in darkness to the skin, splashing his body, arms, legs, and head with raw liquor. He drank it, snuffed some up his nose. Then he dressed in Faber's old clothes and shoes. He tossed his own clothing into the river and watched it swept away. Then, holding the suitcase, he walked out into the river until there was no bottom, and he was swept away into the dark. So you get this really interesting image painted by Ray Bradbury here of this is something that's been going on in this society anyway, that they're relying on each other. They're relying on people in the society to drop dime on each other, or to rat each other out, or to say they suspect something bad going on, only for it to maybe ultimately happen to them one day. This is kind of the process. Everyone's really anxious and fearful, and it really is explained in this with this manhunt that's on the parlor walls. It's waking people up late at night and having them participate in the hunt for Montag. But he makes it to the river just in time. Jumps in, drops his clothes, puts on Faber's, douses himself in liquor, and he makes his way out, hopefully before anybody sees him. He was 300 yards downstream when the hound reached the river. Overhead, the great racketing fans of the helicopters hovered. A storm of light fell upon the river, and Montag dived under the great illumination as if the sun had broken the clouds. He felt the river pull him farther on its way into darkness. And then the lights switched back to the land. The helicopter swerved over the city again, as if they had picked up another trail, and they were gone. The hound was gone. Now there was only the cold river and Montag floating in a sudden peacefulness away from the city and the lights and the chase, away from everything. He felt as if he had left a stage behind and many actors. He felt as if he had left the great seance and all the murmuring ghosts. He was moving from an unreality that was frightening into a reality that was unreal because it was new. The black land slid by, and he was going into the country among the hills. For the first time in a dozen years, the stars were coming out above him, and a great processions of wheeling fire. He saw a great juggernaut of stars form in the sky and threaten to roll over and crush him. He floated on his back when the valise filled and sank. The river was mild and leisurely, going away from the people who ate shadows for breakfast and steam for lunch and vapors for supper. The river was very real. It held him comfortably, gave him time at last, the leisure to consider this month, this year, and a lifetime of years. He listened to his heart slow. His thoughts stopped rushing with his blood. He saw the moon low in the sky now. The moon there, and the light of the moon caused by what? Well, by the sun, of course. And what lights the sun? Its own fire. And the sun goes on day after day, burning and burning. The sun and time. The sun and time in burning. Burning. The river bobbled him along gently. Burning. The sun and every clock on the earth. It all came together and became a single thing in his mind. After a long time of floating on the land and a short time of floating in the river, he knew why he must never burn again in his life. The sun burnt every day. It burnt time. The world rushed in a circle and turned on its axis, and the time was busy burning the years and the people anyway, without any help from him. So if he burnt things with the firemen, and the sun burnt time, that meant that everything burned. One of them had to stop burning. The sun wouldn't, certainly, so it looked as if it had to be Montag, and the people that he worked with until a few short hours ago. Somewhere the saving and putting away had to begin again, and someone had to do the saving and keeping one way or another, in books and records and people's heads, any way at all, so long as it was safe, free from moths and silverfish and rust and dry rot and men with matches. The world was full of burning of all types and sizes, and now the guild of the asbestos weaver must open up shop very soon. So as he's kind of floating down this river, it's interesting because Montag has been this guy who kind of gets wrapped up in nature and throughout this. Like, he gets caught up in the things that Clarice was really interested in. And so as he's floating on down this river, he starts thinking about burning. He starts thinking about the sun and burning of time, metaphorically burning of time. Those days are just being burned away. You know, you're losing time. And then the firemen are burning, and so everything's burning. So at what point do you have nothing? At what point is everything gone? And he says something really interesting, that now it's going to be time for the books and records and people's heads to keep things safe from those people with matches, to start putting things away instead of just getting rid of everything. If you get rid of everything, then there's nothing. And so Montag's using this opportunity as he's kind of floating down. I want you to imagine him just on his back, looking up at the sky, floating down the river. But this is who he is. He's proven that he is pretty reflective. He is thoughtful. He is thinking a lot about what's going on. And he's thinking about what's happened in the last month or so, since Clarice has kind of turned his life upside down and kind of pointed out the things that he really wasn't happy. He felt his heel bump land, touch pebbles and rocks and scrape sand. The river had moved him toward shore. He looked in at the great black creature without eyes or light, without shape, with only a size that went 1,000 miles without wanting to stop, with its grass hills and forests that were waiting for him. He hesitated to leave the comforting flow of the water. He expected the hound there. And suddenly the trees might blow under a great wind of helicopters. But there was only the normal autumn wind high up, going by like another river. Why wasn't the hound running? Why had the search veered inland? Montag listened. Nothing. Nothing. Millie, he thought. All this country here. Listen to it. Nothing and nothing. So much silence, Millie. I wonder how you'd take it. Would you shout, "Shut up, shut up"? Millie. Millie. And he was sad. Millie was not here, and the hound was not here, but the dry smell of hay blowing from some distant field put Montag on the land. He remembered a farm he had visited when he was very young, one of the rare few times he discovered that somewhere behind the seven veils of unreality, beyond the walls of parlors and beyond the tin moat of the city, cows chewed grass, pigs sat in warm ponds at noon, and dogs barked after white sheep on a hill. Now, the dry smell of hay, the motion of the waters, made him think of sleeping in fresh hay in a lonely barn, away from the loud highways, behind a quiet farmhouse, and under an ancient windmill that whirred like the sound of passing years overhead. He lay in the high barn loft all night, listening to distant animals and insects and trees, the little motions and stirrings. During the night, he thought, below the loft, he would hear a sound like feet moving, perhaps. He would tense and sit up. The sound would move away, and he would lie back and look out the loft window very late in the night and see the lights go out in the farmhouse itself until a very young and beautiful woman would sit in an unlit window, braiding her hair. It would be hard to see her, but her face would be like the face of the girl so long ago in his past now. So very long ago. The girl who had known the weather and never been burnt by the fireflies. The girl who had known what dandelions meant when rubbed off on your chin. And then she would be gone from the warm window and appear again upstairs in her moon-whitened room. And then, to the sound of death, the sound of jets cutting the sky in two black pieces beyond the horizon. He would lie in the loft, hidden and safe, watching those strange new stars over the rim of the earth, fleeing from the soft color of dawn. In the morning, he would not have needed sleep, for all the warm odors and sights of complete country night would have rested and slept him while his eyes were wide and his mouth, when he thought to test it, was half a smile. And there at the bottom of the hayloft stair, waiting for him, would be an incredible thing. He would step carefully down in the pink light of early morning, so fully aware of the world that he would be afraid, and stand over the small miracle and at last bend to touch it. A cool glass of fresh milk, and a few apples and pears laid at the foot of the steps. This was all he wanted now. Some signs that the immense world would accept him and give him the long time he needed to think all the things that must be thought. A glass of milk, an apple, a pear. He stepped from the river. The land rushed at him like a tidal wave. He was crushed by darkness and the look of the country and the million odors on a wind that iced his body. He fell back under the breaking curve of darkness and sound and smell, his ears roaring. He whirled. The stars poured over his sight like flaming meteors. He wanted to plunge in the river again and let it idle him safely on down somewhere. This dark land rising was like that day in his childhood swimming, when from nowhere the largest wave in the history of remembering slammed him down in salt mud and green darkness, water burning mouth and nose and retching his stomach, screaming, too much water. It was too much land. Out of the black wall before him, a whisper. A shape. In the shape, two eyes. The night looking at him. The forest seeing him. The hound. After all the running and rushing and sweating it out, half drowning, to come this far, work this hard, and think yourself safe, and sigh with relief, and come out on land at last only to find the hound. Montag gave one last agonized shout as if this were too much for any man. The shape exploded away. The eyes vanished. The leaf piles flew up in a dry shower. And Montag was alone in the wilderness. It's a deer. He smelled the heavy musk-like perfume mingled with blood and the gummed exhalation of the animal's breath, all cardamom and moss and ragweed odor in his huge night where the trees ran at him and pulled away and ran and pulled away to the pulse of the heart behind his eyes. There must have been 1 billion leaves on the land, and he waded in them. A dry river smelling of hot cloves and warm dust. And the other smells. There was a smell like a cut potato from all the land, raw and cold and white from having the moon on it most of the night. There was a smell like pickles from a bottle, and a smell like parsley on a table at home, and there was a faint yellow odor like mustard from a jar. There was a smell like carnations from the yard next door. He put down his hand and felt a weed rise up like a child brushing him. His fingers smelled of licorice. He stood breathing, and the more he breathed the land in, the more he was filled up with all of the details of the land. He was not empty. There was more than enough here to fill him. There would always be more than enough. He walked into the shallow tides of leaves, stumbling. And in the middle of the strangeness, a familiarity. His foot hit something that rang dully. He moved his hand on the ground, a yard this way, a yard that. The railroad track. The track that came out of the city and rusted across the land through forests and woods, deserted now by the river. Here was the path to wherever he was going. Here was the single familiar thing, the magic charm he might need a little while to touch, to feel beneath his feet as he moved on into the bramble bushes and the lakes of smelling and feeling and touching, among the whispers and the blowing down of leaves. He walked on the track. And he was surprised to learn how certain he suddenly was of a single fact that he could not prove. Once, long ago, Clarice had walked here, where he was walking now. So he finally makes his way out of the river. He thought it was the hound. Turns out it's just a deer hanging out in the woods. Just complete openness out in nature. And he makes his way to the railroad tracks, which was something that Faber had told him about, if you remember from last week's reading, is that out in the outside of the city, there are railroad tracks. They're not used anymore by the civilization. And that's where a lot of other people kind of hang out, or people who are like maybe fugitives from the law for whatever reason, because of books or whatever. He said a lot of old college degrees are out there. All the more educated thinking people are out there because they're fugitives now, and that was their place to escape, and nobody really looks for them out there. So he's on the train tracks. That's what he's doing as he's walking away. A half an hour later, cold and moving carefully on the tracks, fully aware of his entire body, his face, his mouth, his eyes stuffed with blackness, his ears stuffed with sound, his legs prickled with burrs and nettles, he saw the fire ahead. The fire was gone, and then back again like a winking eye. He stopped, afraid he might blow the fire out with a single breath. But the fire was there, and he approached warily from a long way off. It drew the better part of 15 minutes before he drew very close indeed to it. And then he stood looking at it from cover. That small motion, the white and red color, a strange fire because it meant a different thing to him. It was not burning. It was warming. He saw many hands held to its warmth. Hands without arms hidden in the darkness. Above the hands, motionless faces that were only moved and tossed and flickered with firelight. He hadn't known the fire could look this way. He had never thought in his life that it could give as well as take. Even its smell was different. How long he stood there he did not know, but there was a foolish yet delicious sense of knowing himself as an animal come from the forest, drawn by the fire. He was a thing of brush, of liquid eye, of fur and muzzle and hoof, and he was a thing of horn and blood that would smell like autumn if you bled it out on the ground. He stood a long time, listening to the warm crackle of the flames. There was a silence gathered all about that fire, and the silence was in the men's faces. The time was there, time enough to sit by this rusting track under the trees, and look at the world and turn it over with the eyes, as if were held to the center of the bonfire, a piece of steel these men were all shaping. It was not only the fire that was different, but it was the silence. Montag moved toward this special silence that was concerned with all the world. And then voices began, and they were talking, and he could hear nothing of what the voices said, but the sound rose and fell quietly, and the voices were turning the world over and looking at it. The voices knew the land and the trees and the city which lay down the track by the river. The voices talked of everything. There was nothing they could not talk about, and he knew from the very cadence and motion and continual stir of curiosity and wonder in them. And then one of the men looked up and saw him for the first or perhaps seventh time, and a voice called to Montag, "All right, you can come out now." Montag stepped back in the shadows. "It's all right," the voice said. "You're welcome here." Montag walked slowly toward the fire, and the 5 old men sitting there dressed in the dark blue denim pants and jackets and dark blue shirts. He did not know what to say to them. "Sit down," said the man who seemed to be the leader of the small group. "Have some coffee?" He watched the dark, steaming mixture pour into a collapsible tin cup, which was handed him straight off. He sipped it gingerly and felt them looking at him with curiosity. His lips were scalded, but that was good. The faces around him were bearded, but the beards were clean, neat, and their hands were clean. They had stood up as if to welcome a guest, and now they sat down again. Montag sipped. "Thanks," he said. "Thanks very much." "You're welcome, Montag. My name's Granger." He held out a small bottle of colorless fluid. "Drink this, too. It'll change the chemical index of your perspiration. Half an hour from now, you'll smell like 2 other people. With the hound after you, the best thing's bottoms up." Montag drank the bitter fluid. "You'll stink like a bobcat. That's all right," said Granger. "You know my name," said Montag. Granger nodded to a portable battery TV set by the fire. "We've watched the chase. Figured you'd wind up south along the river. When we heard you plunging around out in the forest like a drunken elk, we didn't hide as we usually do. We figured you were in the river when the helicopter camera swung back in over the city. Something funny there. The chase is still running. The other way, though." "The other way?" "Well, let's have a look." Granger snapped the portable viewer on. The picture was a nightmare. Condensed, easily passed from hand to hand in the forest, all wearing color and flight. A voice cried, "The chase continues north in the city. Police helicopters are converging on Avenue 87 in Elm Grove Park." Granger nodded. "They're faking. You threw them off at the river. They can't admit it. They know they can hold their audience only so long. The show's got to have a snap ending quick. If they started searching the whole damn river, it might take all night, so they're sniffing for a scapegoat to end things with a bang. Watch. They'll catch Montag in the next 5 minutes." "But how?" "Watch." The camera, hovering in the belly of a helicopter, now swung down at an empty street. "You see that?" whispered Granger. "It'll be you. Right up at the end of the street is our victim. See how our camera's coming in, building the scene, suspense, long shot? Right now some poor fellow is out for a walk. A rarity. An odd one. Don't think the police don't know the habits of queer ducks like that. Men who walk mornings for the hell of it, or for reasons of insomnia. Anyway, the police have never charted for months. Never know when that sort of information might be handy. And today it turns out it's very usable indeed. It saves face. Oh God, look there." The men at the fire bent forward. On the screen, a man turned a corner. The mechanical hound rushed forward into the viewer, suddenly. The helicopter lights shot down a dozen brilliant pillars that built a cage all about the man. A voice cried, "There's Montag! The search is done!" The innocent man stood bewildered, a cigarette burning in his hand. He stared at the hound, not knowing what it was. He probably never knew. He glanced up at the sky and the wailing sirens. The camera rushed down. The hound leapt up into the air with a rhythm and a sense of timing that was incredibly beautiful. Its needle shot out. It was suspended for a moment in their gaze as if to give the vast audience time to appreciate everything. The raw look of the victim's face, the empty street, the steel animal, and a bullet nosing the target. "Montag, don't move," said a voice in the sky. The camera fell upon the victim, even as did the hound. Both reached him simultaneously. The victim was seized by the hound and the camera in a great spidering, clenching grip. He screamed. He screamed. He screamed. Blackout. Silence. Darkness. Montag cried out in the silence and turned away. Silence. And then, after a time of the men sitting around the fire, their faces expressionless, an announcer on the dark screen said, "The search is over. Montag is dead. A crime against society has been avenged." Darkness. "We now take you to the Sky Room of the Hotel Lux for a half hour of Just Before Dawn, a program of..." Granger turned it off. They didn't show the man's face in focus. Did you notice? Even your best friends couldn't tell if it was you. They scrambled it just enough to let the imagination take over. "Hell," he whispered. "Hell." Montag said nothing, but now, looking back, sat with his eyes fixed to the blank screen, trembling. Granger touched Montag's arm. "Well, welcome back from the dead." Montag nodded. Granger went on. "Well, you might as well know all of us now. This is Fred Clement, a former occupant of the Thomas Hardy Chair at Cambridge in the years before it became an atomic engineering school. This other is Dr. Simmons from UCLA, a specialist in Ortega y Gasset. Professor West here did quite a bit for ethics and ancient study now for Columbia University quite some years ago. Reverend Pat over here gave a few lectures 30 years ago and lost his flock between one Sunday and the next for his views. He's been bumming with us for some time now. Myself, I wrote a book called The Fingers in the Glove, the proper relationship between the individual and society. And here I am. Welcome, Montag." "I don't belong with you," said Montag at last slowly. "I've been an idiot all the way." "We're used to that. We all made the right kind of mistakes, or we wouldn't be here. When we were separate individuals, all we had was rage. I struck a fireman when he came to burn my library years ago. I've been running ever since. You want to join us, Montag?" And that's where we'll stop for today. So we meet a new character in Granger. And Granger is a character that is kind of similar to Faber in terms of his knowledge, right? He's a writer. He's actually written this book here. And it's an interesting title, The Fingers in the Glove, the proper relationship between the individual and society. And here I am. So this fingers in the glove, this idea of being able to kind of take that off to separate yourself from society. Obviously, that would be something very different in a society that wants people to conform. They want people in this society to be like everyone else. Everyone must be the same. No one can be different. Otherwise, people are sad and upset and no one's happy. So that would make him very unpopular. He's a smart guy, right? So him and Faber have that in common, but you also get the idea too, he's had to defend himself. He's had to escape a fireman from coming to his house, and now he's on the run. And that's one of the things that makes him a little bit different than Faber. Faber's kind of holed himself up and protected himself, and Granger is a guy who's had to fend for his life and run and escape, just like Montag did. And so at the very end here, you meet all these other college degrees, right? Essentially, all these other really smart individuals, a religious man, a professor, all these different people who are there and who have escaped the society similar to Montag. And he feels like he doesn't belong, but really he has that in common with them. So we'll see how the book wraps up tomorrow. We'll finish up Fahrenheit 451 tomorrow. So let's plan on that. Make sure you answer your questions in your reading guide, and I hope to talk to you more tomorrow, for sure, as our last day of Fahrenheit concludes. You guys have a good day.